Thank you, Speaker. I rise to support the motion put by the Premier. Can I begin by acknowledging the families affected, the firefighters, police, paramedics, SES, Red Cross, Salvos, CAD and Vic Fire call takers, United Firefighters Union, the Police Association, the hospital staff and many others who played significant roles in the Black Saturday fires and in the Royal Commission later. I'd also like to acknowledge my incredibly strong friend, the member for Yan Yan, who's not in the House at the moment, but, oh, there you are, fantastic. And also anyone else in this House that played a role or found themselves dealing with those fires, whether that be at the time or years later. And I'd like to put out there straight away that the way Premier Brumby at the time coped or managed this and led Victoria through these days was the first time I ever looked at a political leader and said, that's what real leadership is. Yeah. On the 7th of February 2009, Victoria experienced the worst bushfires in our nation's history. Tragically, 173 people died and many more families were destroyed by the 400 fires across Victoria. We know that over 1 million acres were burnt, 7,500 people were displaced and 3,500 structures destroyed. However, many more lives were saved. That loss and that personal toll, those scars, will be felt for the rest of people's lives, and they will reverberate through generations as some families struggle to rebuild their lives. It was estimated that the amount of energy released during the firestorm in the King Lake Marysville area was equivalent to the amount of energy released by 1,500 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. And when you see the pictures, you can believe that. I generally don't make a habit of speaking in public about my experiences on Black Saturday, and I don't think I have before. I think there's much more to be gained by listening to the inspirational stories of people who survived and those that rebuilt their lives. But today I'd like to break my own rule and just briefly share some of my more palatable experiences from a firefighter's perspective, and my angle is that we need to talk about how we responded as a state in the 10 years post-Black Saturday and what we can do now. On Black Saturday, I was working at Frankston Fire Station on Delta Platoon, and please forgive me if I stumble or falter a little bit. We formed up as a strike team and became a task force at Helen Fire Station and began asset protection at Labatouche that morning as the Bunyip State Park fire had broken containment lines at 5 a.m. The temp of the day was 46.4 degrees Celsius, the highest ever recorded in Melbourne, and all the conditions that we had calculated led to an astronomically high risk profile for the tasks we were set to, and the more experienced on the shift agreed on quite a few plans of when things went wrong, because on that day things were going to go wrong. We had always used the CSIRO Fire Danger Index, which many people are familiar with. It's a rating system based on the 1939 fires. It goes from 0 to 100, 100 being the worst fire you could ever experience. Retrospectively, the Fire Danger Index was applied to the conditions on Black Saturday, and we saw ratings of 200, which is twice as intense as any fire conditions ever imagined. Figures not even contemplated by scientists, and fire behaviour not ever recorded before. I am happy to say, though, that didn't stop the resilience that manifests as humour for, I guess, the dark humour that bubbles away amongst fire crews. And I remember coming down the Princess Highway in the back seat of a fire truck with a very new firefighter next to me, and he could see the mushroom cloud in front of us, which had broken through the inversion layer and started drawing air up and making its own weather system. And he said, "Is that the fire?" And I forget who actually said it, whether it was me or someone else, but we said, no, relax, it's all good. And he kind of looked at us and we said, "Oh, that's just the rain cloud with a new front coming through. If you've got your raincoat, you're going to need it. Let's put the fire out before you even get there. You'll be right." We all had a bit of a chuckle, but about an hour later, as day turned to absolute midnight and the wind made it sound like a train was travelling an inch from your face, that junior firefighter looked at me, his eyes like dinner plates. I remember he was pulling a hose and he was shaking uncontrollably, but he was still able to overcome his fear, and he yelled at me, but I couldn't hear it, but I could see his lips move, and he said, "Very funny, you bastard." I now know that this fire was spotting 20 k's to the south of us and completely overrunning us. I arrived home at 2 a.m, and it was then that I realised that we had been in a bubble most of that day. It was a very bad fire where we were, but we had been in a bubble and we'd been very lucky. I was back out again, so I got home at 2, was back out again at 6 for the next couple of weeks. I was first relocated to Healesville, then Kinglake, where 38 people died, Kinglake West, where 4 people died, Strathune, where 27 people died, Marysville, where 34 people died, and found my way down to Narberthong. In those days, those early days where we didn't have the fully qualified rescue teams from police, we were operating on figures that weren't accurate, and as far as we were concerned, the fact that we didn't know how many people were missing or were casualties was enough motivation just to keep on going. To the point where my comms log actually says that I was at the Dandenongs one day, and to be honest, Mr. Speaker, I just don't remember it. Men, women and kids were found where they took their final refuge from fire, usually within the rubble of their homes, sometimes outside and sometimes in cars. Some residents climbed in their water tanks to find refuge from the fire without knowing that the water could boil. Climbing up the ladders to inspect the contents of elevated water tanks is, in a word, harrowing. In some cases, the only way we could identify that people had actually, they were in their final resting place was if the ashes formed a familiar human shape. In cars, cars were that far gone that the only way we could tell if someone was in the car is if the metal from the buckle was still there and the tongue piece was locked into the seatbelt, and we would assume that someone had likely been cremated in that car. I realised how strong some of the people I was working with were when we came across a volunteer firefighter who had been on our strike team, and we were searching through cars, and it wasn't until we got back that this firefighter collapsed in the female toilet, and we'd realised that she'd held it in, but she'd actually just identified one of her best friends in a car and hadn't told anyone. I openly admit that I've never been more scared than I was on Black Saturday. I've never been so challenged mentally or physically, just challenged on every level all at once, just every sense being bombarded and assaulted, fighting to breathe just superheated air at 100 k's an hour, struggling to see 1 foot in front of me, trying to dodge flying pieces of debris, trying to stick with a plan when we ran out of plans hours ago, attempting to hear which truck this time was actually calling a mayday and if we were actually in a location to help them, and trying to make sure we saved people, but at the same time we're in a position to live another day. For many people in the emergency services community, this day is as raw as it comes, and it's just like yesterday. Many people are at peace with it, some people aren't, and it was life-changing for so many people in our community, but also our emergency services community. I've witnessed the suicides, the marriage breakdowns, the PTSD issues, the alcohol and drug issues, and it was actually the only other day that I realised when I was writing this that no one from the crew I went away with has actually escaped relationship issues at the very least. I'm lucky though. My takeaway mentality generally has been that this event made me refocus on who I need to be and what I want to do with my life. And I still feel honoured to have served my community in that way during the Black Saturday fires and that period after. And I must admit that after being pushed that far, nothing seems scary anymore. Nothing seems too much of a challenge. Nothing seems like too hard work. But many people do struggle, and that's why it's a step in the right direction to be doing more than ever to tackle post-traumatic stress disorder by reforming the mental health services and supporting police and emergency services with a pilot scheme for provisional acceptance of work cover claims. This event, Mr. Speaker, made many people realise what I think most people in this room already know, and that's that we do have the best firefighters in the business here in Victoria and Australia. They are renowned internationally. But to be honest, on that day, we were thinking on the run because our systems just didn't cater for this unprecedented event. And so I'd ask, what has changed in 10 years? And I would say a hell of a lot's changed in 10 years. By responding to the Black Saturday Royal Commission recommendations, we've changed for the better, and we are better prepared than ever to face the large fires that we will have to face again. But I want to be abundantly clear that we are 10 years on and we still have more work to do. And when firefighters are putting everything on the line and community lives are at stake, we just can't accept the status quo, that the status quo will do. It's our responsibility to remember this event today, but it's so important that we don't sell the memory of these people short and the memory of these people living with these scars short. As legislators, we can't ignore the facts. We must have an intelligent conversation and act to ensure that no matter what the incident is, a fire, a car accident, a hazmat incident. Our community have the most dynamic response and life-saving capability to minimise the scale of tragedy in the face of increasing fire risk. As the late Stephen Hawking stated, intelligence is the ability to adapt and change. And for many of us, Black Saturday clarified the need to change very, very abruptly. Black Saturday made us realise that we couldn't continue to base our fire service decisions on data and practices from the last century. Black Saturday made us realise that we can't continue to base our fire service on the climate of last century. Climate change is real, and with it comes faster, more intense, less predictable fires. And now I think most objective people realise that we can't continue to operate our fire services on legislation designed for last century's Victoria. The CFA was actually created in the wake of over 100 deaths between 1939 and 1944 out of a need to reform a system that was operating in the previous century, the 1800s. And Mr. Speaker, we've come to that crossroads again. In 2019, we find ourselves again operating in a system serving the requirements of the last century. And I can think of no better example of how antiquated the legislation is operationally than considering that it actually defines Greater Dandenong with a population of 161,000 people as a country area requiring a country fire service. Although our state experienced the worst fire incident in our nation's history, our fire services model still remains governed by the second oldest legislation in the nation, which was enacted in 1958. Our population was 2 million in 1958. It's now tripled, and so have the challenges that face our fire services. Not a day goes by, Mr. Speaker, I don't think about how we could have saved more lives or made our response better and make sure our emergency service workers, just like every other worker, gets home safe to their family. 6 of 8 territories or states have seen fit to reform and evolve their fire service legislation to meet changing conditions since 1979, and I think Victoria needs that reform too. And emergency services personnel need to know that we aren't compromising their safety by not taking up that challenge. In Victoria, Mr. Speaker, in our darkest hours, heroes arrive in droves. Some in uniform, some not. On Black Saturday, our devoted emergency workers, staff and volunteer displayed a courage, a resilience and an Australian spirit that we should all be immensely proud of and celebrate. Our community held its ground through the worst nature could throw at us, and I've got to say I personally witnessed the best displays of compassion and humanity I've ever seen and most likely will ever see, although we know that period was heartbreaking. For many Victorians, of course, every day remains a private memorial, but tomorrow I'd ask everyone here to please make sure you ring someone you know that was touched by the fire, directly or indirectly. Some will be quiet, some might overcompensate by being a bit chatty. They might not want to talk about it at all, but you've probably done someone a favour just by asking those 3 simple words, are you okay? To everyone present here today, thank you for listening, and remember, this affects everyone, and if you need help, realising it and reaching out is the hardest part. It gets easier after the first step. Thank you.